All right, man. So what do you do on your day-to-day now?
I'm actually, this is hilarious, and we maybe should have started with this. I'm currently learning in the Pardes Yeshiva in Talpiot for the next year on a fellowship with a small stipend. It's like a very pluralistic co-ed yeshiva, and that's most of the day, like a full, really like a full work week, 9 to 5, 9 to 5:30 every day. Um, and other than that, I'm doing a lot of different freelance journalism. I've been writing a lot for a newspaper called The Progressive recently. I have a piece coming out for JTA soon, and mostly about my own activist experience, some analysis, but I try not to do that too much because anyone can do that.
Gotcha.
And other than that, direct, documentation and accompaniment in the West Bank. That's been very, very difficult in the past few weeks, but I have still been going in, and we'll keep going in, and just hoping that things get better sooner rather than later.
Okay, cool. If you're good with it, I'm gonna move this to the beginning.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, will do. All right, everybody, welcome back. So with us, we have Sam Stein. Sam, go ahead and introduce yourself. It's usually the part I don't like doing.
Yeah, my name is Sam Stein. One of the most common combinations of names in the world, I guess. Very hard to find on Google. I grew up in a place called the Five Towns in Long Island, a very insular Orthodox Jewish suburb, very upper class and very, very politically right wing. And I kind of just grew up in that environment and always questioned it on some things and less on other things, particularly on Zionism and Israel-Palestine was a place where I kind of really just accepted the narrative. And then when I was 18, I went to spend a gap year in Israel, though for my upbringing, it's barely even a gap year, it's so part of the track. It's high school, a year in Israel, college. That's what you do. And my gap year was actually in an illegal settlement in the West Bank, a place called Efrat. I didn't know what that meant at the time. The first time I ever heard the phrase "the green line" was when I told somebody where I was going for the year, and they said, "Ooh, past the green line, such a good Zionist." I was like, "Okay, apparently." And definitely over that year, saw a lot of things that didn't really sit well with me, but lacked the kind of background knowledge to properly unpack it, and B, I think was kind of just I'm a dumb 18-year-old having fun on their gap year. I'm going to put that in a box and not think about it right now. Particularly the fact that Palestinians had different white license plates, which just screamed. As somebody who grew up in America and despite my upbringing always really considered myself more liberal, that was just oh, that's Jim Crow. That's segregation. And the fact that the checkpoint going in between Israel and the West Bank, you only get checked going from the West Bank into Israel. You don't get checked coming into the West Bank. That kind of something about that seemed off to me, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. And now it makes a lot more sense in terms of having a broader understanding of a context of Israelis having full freedom of movement and Palestinians not. So it doesn't really matter who's coming in because everyone's allowed in, but only certain people are allowed out. And yeah, like I said, saw those things and thought they were weird, but didn't really think about it too much. Definitely left that experience as a pretty streamlined Orthodox American Zionist. And then I got to college, and one of my best friends.
Where we met.
I was in Hunter College. I have a bachelor's in English literature. And one of my best friends, not even a Hunter student, he went to Cornell, but we've been best friends since middle school. He just kind of started talking about the occupation a lot. And I remember thinking, well, I always thought that this was an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, but I don't think that my best friend, Noam Weinreich, who went to Oraita for 2 years in the old city and is still very much Orthodox, is an anti-Semite. So now I need to unpack this all. And I think for a while that kind of just made me think hey, this is a real thing and I'm going to need to decide where I stand at some point. But same thing, kind of just still not sure, not really going to think about it. I know that I like spending time in Israel, and I was able to kind of divorce that from, I guess, from politics for a while, in the sense that like anything's divorceable from politics. I was able to just like go and enjoy my time there without being like very nationalistic about it. And then at the very towards the end of my time in Hunter, it was like at some point in my last year, this guy, this like young Palestinian college student, came to talk to the Hillel Club, like the Jewish culture club. And
Who was the
it's
student, out of curiosity?
I think he was at Ithaca College. I don't remember his name or anything. I barely even remember what
I
he
think I
actually
brought him.
spoke
Keep
about.
going. Amar Akrub.
Honestly, you could give me a million names and I wouldn't be able to tell you.
Okay, keep going.
Which is, it's so funny how like something can have such a profound effect on me without.
Yeah, because I've never heard this story before. Keep going.
So he came to the Hillel. He kind of just like told his story. I don't really remember what like the broader point of it was, but I really, really remember the first thing he mentioned was that he was from Bethlehem, which is right next to Efrat. And that really resonated with me at the time. It was like, oh, we were neighbors. And now that feels like such incredibly naive framing to say we were neighbors when, you know, there's a giant wall between the two towns and like they're under entire different legal systems. One's occupied, one's not. And throughout his talk, at some point, he mentioned all of the permits he needed to get to go to Jordan to fly to the US. And in general, I think that would have struck a chord with me, but specifically having already kind of made that very visceral emotional connection based on the geography of it, I was just kind of like, wait, what? And I remember like I just landed, you know, I bought a plane ticket, landed, and like started walking around like I own the place. And I remember thinking that's apartheid. And that was definitely, you know, this was in 2017. And I think that word still is, you know, very controversial in the context of Israel Palestine. I think it was much more so for sure. Certainly for me, it was much more controversial. But I was kind of just like, oh, that's what it is. And that was definitely kind of the point of no return. I think after that, you know, I graduated college. I actually came to Israel to spend some time with cousins and just like see some friends and family and just explore a lot and really kind of unpack things in a very personal, physical way by just going to places that had until then seemed forbidden to me almost. I remember I went to a tour of Ramallah and I showed up wearing a kippah, and I remember thinking like, I'm just gonna go and like if somebody tells me to take it off, I'll take it off. And the tour guide's like, you should take that off. And I'm like, okay, fine. And after that, he was just kind of like very curious about me because it was really me and a bunch of European and Chinese tourists. And I remember we went to Ramallah. We had like a 10-minute like lunch break, you know, get some coffee and whatever. And we were talking, and he's like, it's not what you expected, right? I'm like, no, it's kind of like Tel Aviv. And he's like, yeah, pretty much. What does your family think about the fact that you're here? I'm like, nothing. They will never know.
That's I'm sure we can relate. I mean, as far as you, me, the viewers, yeah, we know.
Yeah.
So how'd that work? Let me start digging into this. Did you just call up, you know, just some random tour guide saying, hey, I want to go visit the most prohibited place in my upbringing?
I wish, honestly. I saw it through the Abraham Hostel, which is like this pretty like big, well-known hostel. They have a branch in Jerusalem and one in Tel Aviv, like maybe another one, I don't really know. And I just kind of, I don't remember if I was actively looking for stuff or just kind of stumbled upon it, but I basically saw this tour of the West Bank and it was like, go to Bethlehem, Ramallah, and Jericho on like this 1-day West Bank tour. And I'm like, oh, that sounds cool. And I think, you know, same thing again. I think Bethlehem really appealed to me. I was like, oh, I want to see, you know, the quote unquote other side. And I remember getting to Bethlehem and thinking, I wonder how many people have been on both sides of this wall.
So let's rewind a bit. You told me right before we jumped on, you went to DRS Yeshiva.
Yeah.
What was your exposure to Israel throughout. I'm assuming you're in elementary and high school.
Yeah.
All right, yeah. So I mean, what was that like within those 12 grades?
I think very kind of just baked into everything was this right-wing Zionism. I think it's a little different than some other more modern Orthodox Yeshiva day schools. DRS is kind of like already past the bell curve on Orthodoxy, where it becomes a little less Zionist, still very, very Zionist, but like talking to friends that went to other yeshiva day schools like SAR or Flatbush or places like that, they have this very formal Zionist education. We didn't really have that. We just kind of had rabbis talking about this thing all the time in very informal context while going off on tangents during classes. The most kind of formal thing is that when Gilad Shalit, the soldier who was, held hostage in Gaza for how many years by Hamas, when he was captive, we said tefillah. We would like pray and say tehillim for him every single day after the morning services of davening. Yeah, and really kind of, I think the main formal things were that and this underlying assumption that everyone would go for a gap year to learn yeshiva in Israel.
Right. So, I mean, fast forward to where we met in Hunter. I mean, I remember I had almost no exposure to know even what a Palestinian was. I remember briefly, just because I've always been sort of in tune with the news. I love the news since I was pretty young. It's nerdy, I know. My in the 2006 war with Lebanon, it was 06 or 08. I'm getting fuzzy now. I remember seeing Palestinian flags on my parents' bedroom TV, and that's it. The only thing I knew is if I see that flag, that means bad. And that's it until I get to Hunter and I see an anti-tuition rally, and then there were it was the Million Student March at the time. There were Palestinian flags being waved there, saying it's because of Zionism tuition is going up, and I realized, all right, something's weird here. Until then, I condensed my classes into 2 days. I worked as a litigation paralegal the other 3 days a week. I wanted nothing to do with extracurriculars at all. And then once I saw that, I'm like, all right, let me dig into this a little bit, because people are calling for my expulsion from CUNY and even a little worse. So I actually spent that night reading up on the Nakba. I never had any idea what that was. Sabra Shatila. I had no idea what that was. Things that I'm like, whoa, I really just learned half the book. And I then wrote an email to, at the time, President Reb, Chancellor Milliken, saying that demonstration cannot be acceptable. I can't be funding an organization like that within the Hunter walls. So I joined the David Project, attended an interfaith trip to Israel, visited the Palestinian territories for the first time in my life. I would have never thought of doing that. We visited Rahat of the Bedouins, and then thankfully I helped instrumentally plan Hunter's second interfaith trip, but that was through the Maccabee Task Force. When you saw Palestinian flags waving in Hunter for the first time, if at all, what was your first exposure like?
Yeah, I do remember that rally, and it's so funny. It's so long ago. It's hard to kind of like,
yeah. No, it was so transformative for me. That's why it just has such an imprint on me.
Yeah, and it's obviously like I remember how I felt at the time, and it's hard to think how I would feel now if the exact same thing happened.
Right.
Like definitely look back at some things and like, oh, that crossed a line and didn't feel okay. Even though I think if it happened now, I'd be like overall pretty supportive of a lot of like the broader points. I really did, even though I kind of started unpacking things a lot while in college, had so little exposure to Palestinians or like, pro-Palestinian or anti-occupation student groups or anything like that. I remember my very last year, I kind of started getting involved in some J Street stuff. Mm-hmm. And, same thing. Like, I guess I went to one big Shabbaton where there was a lot of like workshopping more amongst like Jewish members of J Street. And like, I can't even remember. I think a Palestinian spoke to us. but I don't really remember. I remember they started a lot of campaigning for the village Susia that was facing really bad demolition and eviction threats at the time. And it stayed very, very abstract for me. It was just kind of like, I know my moral code and I know that kicking people out of their homes is wrong. So like, I'm bored with this. I would say it really wasn't until I got here that I broke down that wall of actually meeting Palestinians and being viscerally and emotionally engaged and committed in that sense. I do remember after I moved here already, somebody told me to download. There's this NGO called Zochrot that specifically focuses on education around the Nakba, and it's kind of very in contrast to a lot of the other left-wing NGOs in Israel Palestine that are much more focused on the 67 occupation. And I remember somebody was like, oh, you should download their app. They have this educational app. It's called like I Return Now. It used to be called I Nakba. Both horrible names, great app. And it basically
that much I was withholding, but keep going.
And you basically open it up and it just shows a map with a pin of every single displaced Palestinian village during the Nakba. And I remember opening up and just like praying to God that there would be no pin on my location. And I was living in North Tel Aviv at the time, so it almost definitely was. I don't even.
And to narrow down on that, that means where pre-establishment of the state of Israel, there was a Palestinian town there.
Exactly.
I see. Okay.
And I remember through that reading more about Zochrot and their stance on the Palestinian law of return, and like fighting for the Palestinian right of return and any sort of just solution that all Palestinian refugees be able to come back and obtain full citizenship in this land, you know, and like whatever sort of future government exists. And I remember reading that and kind of just being like, yeah, that was common sense to me. You know, that seems like very obviously moral and to make perfect sense in a restorative justice sense of like, well, Jews can do that, Palestinians should be able to do that. And it's funny, I also remember thinking like, oh, I guess I'm not a Zionist. Like if you support Palestinian,
this was all in the span of your J Street exposure in college.
So sorry, yeah, I kind of jumped forward. There's a pretty big gap in between this. This is like starting from my exposure to J Street in college, and then after college, I was abroad, and you know, not so entrenched.
I guess that's when the whole app download thing happened forward.
Yeah, exactly.
Got
About
it.
a year, almost 2 years after that, when I eventually moved to Tel Aviv. I was living in Tel Aviv after college already.
Gotcha. So in college, actually, so on that David Project trip, there was Amr, who I met. He grew up in the West Bank, and we were sort of buddy on the trip because we're both. Well, he's actually an Arab. I'm first generation removed, and we spoke. We bonded over the cultural similarities between us, and we spoke to the locals of both the Israeli and Palestinian territories and in their native language. Obviously, I know Hebrew from not just my yeshiva upbringing, but some Israeli friends I had. And I knew very little Arabic, obviously a lot better than I did. So we really bonded between breaking down those language barriers for the both of us. I then brought him to Hunter, and that's why I'm thinking it's him. I just don't know if he's from Bethlehem.
Okay. Gotcha.
And then I brought him to Hunter as a follow-up. I mean, really nice guy. I even texted him a few weeks ago, wishing him best wishes, hoping his family was safe.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's pretty interesting to see. Like, whoa, I had no idea about this story. I mean, and if it's really him, that's like really cool.
Yeah, if we could find out, it would be really. I'd love to have like a name to that story that really.
Yeah, sure.
Made my life.
So, I mean, it's obviously a glaring difference where I ended up in my Zionism Israel journey from my upbringing till now, and then where I guess you're still on that path. You're there. You're advocating. You're involving grassroots effort on the ground. I'm here in America, just living my life, being supportive as I can, but still sort of building my future, I guess, in terms of like business, family. Politics are just like a second thought to me. It's not my main concentration. I still think our ideology is a little different. So I came to a point where I visited the settlement of Efrat, and when I went there, it was right after it was at the very, very end of the Obama term, the lame duck term. The UN passed a resolution saying that East Jerusalem was occupied and the settlements are illegal, and the settlements are illegal, something like that. And I thought, wow, these settlements are a really horrible idea. Throughout college, I continued to learn what settlements were, what occupied territories were, what happened in the 1967 war that I just never really knew about. I then left my trip after visiting Efrat, thinking what one of the presenters there said. I mean, Efrat's been around for over 30 years, and Alfei Menashe also was over 35 at the time, I think. I don't think you can uproot a community like that. I'm definitely against expansion, but where do you fall out on it?
Yeah, I mean, I really pretty much agree with that. It's, logistically impossible. I would have moral issues with it, even if it were possible. That's like one of the few reasons that I definitely think that my vision for a just future in Israel-Palestine is one full equal state. But people have a lot of cynicisms about that.
Right. So you think that the two people can live peacefully side by side with equal rights?
I think we have to. It's not even about can; it's about have to. We don't really have
really. Why is that?
Because nothing else. It's the only thing that can work. The two-state solution is completely dead. The settlements have made it impossible, which was their goal.
So you think practically it's dead just because of the layout?
Yeah. And there's a huge critique. I mean, first of all, coming from my perspective as like an educated Western leftist, I think that ethno-states are bad and I don't want two of them. So that's kind of like my perspective on it. But, even stepping back, the giant population of the Palestinian community, I would probably say most of the Palestinian community feels that a two-state solution is unjust because it's effectively if somebody, invaded your home and squatted and then said, "Oh, I'll give you the kitchen."
Got it. Yeah. I mean, they definitely feel like it's unjust. I mean, Muhammad Yunus at Gallup just came out with a poll pre 10/7, and I think it was dated in March. No, it was right before 10/7. And obviously there was a big decline of support for the two-state solution. When it comes to, let's say, the Obama days, right after he gave his speech in Cairo, where he criticized Israel for settlements pretty heavily, there was good support for it. I mean, by good, I mean like the highest it's been probably since Oslo. And it's really at an all-time low right now. But I mean, personally, I don't think it's possible to live side by side. Sure, we could live peacefully, but we can't live side by side within the same state. Then it resorts to they called it the battle of the bedroom, doesn't it? It's just whoever has the most kids has the most power in the state, and then whoever wins.
I mean, sort of. That's why the end goal has to be actual, decomposition of this racial divide. And that's why I focus so heavily on just kind of breaking down the regime of segregation. We need to get to a point where that stops mattering. I mean, and it's similar for also, definitely to address those concerns, I have a lot of, I guess, sympathy. I relate a lot to the idea of the federation state to basically kind of like allow some sort of independence while
Autonomy, right?
maintaining, yeah, exactly. You know, like some sort of autonomy while maintaining what is in its essence one equal state. Yeah. I also want to give my constant caveat to all of this, which is that like basically anything is better than the status quo. And if a two-state solution happened tomorrow, I'd be kissing strangers in the street.
Okay. All right, fine, cool. So let's shift to the gaps that you had to fill in on your own that Yeshiva didn't. So you touched on the points of, you had this sort of right-wing Zionism that you were impressed with for your elementary and high school years. When it comes to learning about the Nakba and Sabra Shatila, those are just my two go-tos. 67 Executive Order B from 1948's Independence War. How did you fill those gaps in on your
own? It's hard to remember, honestly, because I did it in a very kind of slow, gradual, unofficial capacity, you know, kind of just some Googling here, some reading there, some listening to people, some meeting Palestinians. I think it also kind of worked backwards chronologically. I think it started with just saying, okay, the current reality is not just, and first just kind of learning about what modern day occupation looks like. I think kind of the first kind of click for it was, oh, Palestinians in the West Bank don't have citizenship of any functioning state. I did not know that. And then kind of concretely understanding what happened in 67 and what occupation means, and like, okay, this entire region is under military rule. And then, you know, kind of again, going backwards to 1948 and the Nakba, and unlearning that this just is kind of like this magical moment of, oh, we have a state now. And actually, oh, thousands and thousands of people were kicked out of their homes. And in 47 and 46, this land was predominantly Palestinian. You know, the vast majority of this region was not Jewish, Israeli at the time. And so much as that's like an anachronistic.
So let me interject here. In your opinion, how much of the land is occupied?
I would say what is, you know, internationally recognized as the occupied territories. I do make a big distinction between just and occupied, you know, just because what happened in 1948 was horrific and immoral and an atrocity. And you can very easily say that the whole project is unjust, and I would not push back against that at all. I put a lot into taking kind of occupation is a very specific legal term that means a very specific thing, and it's not accurate to describe Israel that way, and it is accurate to describe, you know, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza with that term.
So you would even say Gaza is occupied?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are no, well, now there are troops on the ground, I guess.
Yeah, let's talk pre-10-7 here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there weren't Israeli troops on the ground, but Israel has full control of the daily reality in Gaza. You know, plenty of legal experts and pretty much all human rights NGOs consider Gaza occupied. And the way I think of it and frame it is, if you live in Gaza, the Israeli election affects your life more than any sort of theoretical Palestinian election. The Israeli government controls your life more than Hamas does.
Gotcha. So let me rewind a bit. When it comes to, you said that you're really not in favor of a two-state solution, but hey, if it happened, that'll be fantastic. What is your position on the, I would say, fact that the Palestinians were offered statehood with the Peel Commission, 48th partition plan, all the way up to Olmert, and I mean, the peace offering of 2000 was a little disputed by Ashrawi, but why the continuous denial of statehood? Would you make just the comparison you did earlier to "we'll give you the kitchen"?
Yeah, yeah. I think you cut out for a second there, but
so I'll repeat it. It's in sum, it's more like, what do you have to say in response to the denials or the consistent denials since before 1948 by the Palestinians rejecting statehood?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it, especially the earlier rejections, kind of stem from that analogy I gave earlier, that this is just an unjust concession starting from unequal territory and positioning. And without like getting it too much, because unfortunately I can't like pull the examples out of my head, but like
Sure.
Israel has absolutely rejected peace deals too. I will say, kind of going back to the closest real peace deal we had was Oslo, and that was a colossal failure. A lot of Palestinians, most notably Edward Said, kind of said at the time that this isn't going to bring any sort of autonomy for Palestinians. It's just going to give an acceptable legal framework for occupation, and that's what happened of now. Instead of occupation being this temporary thing that's supposed to end, according to the Oslo Accords, of course, it is still supposed to end. But what actually happened, and again, Palestinian leadership and intellectuals and thinkers predicted this, and I'm sure plenty of left-wing Israelis and left-wing international Jews and other people, I'm sure, predicted this. Instead, what you have is there's this legal distinction of Area C that kind of gives Israel a justification of like, oh, this is Area C, this is ours, we can do whatever we want here. And oh, Area A, see, there's the PA, there's autonomy because Area A exists. Never mind that Israel enters Area A all the time. And
right. Okay. But I mean, they had their opportunities of statehood. Your argument is they didn't want to settle for just the kitchen of their home. They wanted the whole home.
I think that's, kind of the argument that Palestinians would give. I don't want to speak too much on their behalf.
Right.
My understanding of it.
So I mean, the argument I usually come across is, hey, us being Israel, we offered them statehood a million times, and the Palestinians denied it all times. In practice, and this is where really I fall out. It's a lot of the people on the anti-Israel side don't want to live side by side with Israel. They want a state instead of Israel. That's not just a Netanyahu talking point, but it's something that I have come to see. It's definitely not all of them, but the biggest voices out there are definitely showing that. Do you not see that in practice?
I mean, in practice, I would say that I don't see it because I'm exposed to like very specific voices, and especially through my activism, the Palestinians that I work with, obviously it kind of controls for a certain population that are okay with working with Israeli and Jewish activists and allies. Yeah, and I kind of, my like broader retort, I would say, to that is, that it just kind of spirals in on itself, and we can't just use, oh, they rejected our deal as a justification when like the status quo is so unjust.
So what is justice in your book? How do you define it?
To me, it's very, I guess almost simple. I really try and just like go about everything with like what is both common decency and common sense to me, and work from there. And that is everyone being able to enjoy our standards of human rights and dignity, including freedom of movement, citizenship, the right to vote. And in the immediate term, that means everyone living in Israel, Palestine. And thinking more broadly, I touched upon this earlier, but justice for Palestinians that were expelled during the Nakba. They need the ability to return to their homes the same way that any Jew in the world can get Israeli citizenship at the drop of a hat.
So you believe a full right of return of the Palestinians who were expelled in 1948 to their homes?
Yeah.
And what would happen to the Jews, Israelis occupying those homes now?
I mean, the specific home, kind of like, I would say that I was using the term home more in terms of like the land, not specific houses. Unfortunately, that becomes impossible to,
Right.
regulate
That's a
in
logistic
any
nightmare.
capacity.
I see. Okay. And are you of the belief that the one and only nation state of the Jewish people is historically theirs and they have a legitimate right to exist?
I very strongly believe in the Jewish connection to this land. I would say that I reject a lot of the modern frameworks around states in general. And that I know I'm a Jew that chose to live here, and I find it very meaningful to live in Eretz Israel. And just do not believe that that can ever come at the expense of other people's rights and dignity.
If there were a Palestinian state, do you not think that statehood would be a good thing? Because you're against the general framework of statehood,
right? And that's one of the reasons that I prefer. I mean, I prefer a one-state solution. Like, quite frankly, I prefer a zero-state solution.
More on the side of what gives me a right to point a gun at somebody. There should be no pointing, no guns, no borders. That type of philosophy.
Yeah, definitely. I am very relate a lot to anarchist theory, and I guess would definitely call myself an anarchist. So that, is the starting point for a lot of my beliefs. And in terms of the positionality of like embracing dialogue around the Israeli Jewish nation state, where that's coming from a point where like we already have a state, and entrenching that dialogue is way more about dispossessing Palestinians of their right to self-determination, whereas like the Palestinian call for a state is about achieving their right to self-determination.
But I mean, this is why I have to disagree. I mean, statehood borders preserve your set of values, preserve your identity and history. Especially given the Jewish history, and especially in that region with the hostilities that present itself. I mean, you don't think those borders are necessary for our safety, security, and preservation of our identity?
Not at all, honestly. I understand that is kind of like a radical take to a lot of people, but I think first and foremost, the thing that provides people safety is safety for everyone. Everyone having dignity and their human rights will 99% of the time lower hostility. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to that rule. And in terms of cultural identity, I think that cultural identity can thrive the most when it's in a pluralistic environment. We Jewish identity thrived in Europe. Obviously, we faced horrific anti-Semitism there. And obviously,
and in the Arab world, I have to be equal there.
Yeah. Same exact thing, like, especially in more recent history, there was rampant anti-Semitism and Jews being expelled from the Arab world. But throughout all of that, we had rich Jewish identity. A year or two ago, I had the pleasure of going to the Jewish Museum in Lithuania, and something that struck me about it so much was how much it kind of didn't. It spoke about the Holocaust, obviously, because how could you not? But it was really the first exposure I ever had to this museum that just spoke about the full Jewish history in this land, in that land in Europe, and obviously like modern Lithuania specifically, but the whole region, and how much we thrived. It's funny because in a lot of ways that made all the atrocities we faced in Europe hit me so much more, because I had a new appreciation for what we lost. But, to kind of on a very micro personal level, my Jewish identity meant nothing for me until I left that Orthodox bubble that I grew up in. It's kind of like everyone's Jewish. And then I got to Japan and wore a kippah for a year and had a really beautiful experience of being like the Jew in Japan.
Gotcha. So now that's a good transition towards, I mean, if you're calling for the dissolution of the state as a structure, I mean, right across the border, you have people who on 10/7 showed us what they desire to do to us. And by us, I mean the Jews, especially living in Israel. How can safety and security be ensured without a border? And feel free to go on to 10/7 because that's where I plan on taking this.
Yeah, I mean, like, I wish I had, all the answers, and I quite frankly don't. I'm sure there are people that put way more thought on this to mine that have like more rigorous theory about this. And I would say that, look, like we're stuck. And the only way out is forward instead of the loop we're in, and kind of like any just, there is no just solution at this point that is gonna be pretty. Like that's the unfortunate, horrible reality. But the reality is also that, it didn't start today. It didn't start yesterday. It started decades and decades and decades ago of leading to this, and kind of like, yeah, there are people that want revenge and violence, but we need to push forward and slowly, because it's going to be slow, but also as quickly as possible.
Right. I mean, because like I see what you mean in that. I know a little bit of anarchist theory just from my studies, but in terms of relating it to today and the events that just happened, I mean, I don't see that come into practice. So more focusing on 10/7. The two sides of the argument I've seen is the events of 10/7 forward are pure evil, or the anti-Israel side usually argues that, like the Secretary General said, it didn't happen in a vacuum. These people suffered over 50 years of occupation, and this was all boiling up from that point forward. Are you more of the second argument, saying that the timeline actually began when the occupation started? Or are you of the opinion that no, the events of 10/7 transpired on 10/7, and we have to look at it from that date forward?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the second point. Like, it didn't happen in a vacuum. Nothing happened with a vacuum. And I think that it's almost obvious to me to understand that without justifying what happened on 10/7. It just has to, any proper analysis has to know that it didn't happen, that it didn't start there.
But you would be classifying that as pure evil, terror, condemnable.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. I don't like the word terror because it's very unequally applied. It's like really exclusively applied to stateless actors. But the very short answer is that obviously what happened on October 7th was completely horrific and unjustifiable.
But I mean, whatever your definition of terror, surely what happened has to fall within it. Because, I mean, the definition of terror I'm familiar with is advancing a political agenda through the use of violence. Is whatever you may think of the Israeli side, wouldn't the events of 10/7 fall under that definition?
Yes, almost definitely. I just choose not to use that word because as it is, it's not applied equally. So I feel that when I use that word, it's kind of like entrenching that inequality. If people were accurately calling atrocities committed by the Israeli side, and also broadly speaking, the American government and the American military, and like any sort of kind of like body that enjoys a certain set of legitimacy, that by definition is not accused of terrorism. If those bodies were accused of terrorism properly, then I would be much more liberal with that term.
Got it. So now, I mean, with the events happening in Gaza, I mean, the air raids, the rocket fire, now the ground incursion. What is your overall stance? I mean, Hamas deserves everything and then some in terms of punishment for their actions, in my opinion. And it's Israel's obligation, not just freedom, but obligation to make that happen. I think Israel's being a courteous, at the very least, army by taking precautions to minimize civilian casualty. I'm sure we have a disagreement on something I just said. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I basically disagree about that courtesy. You know, kind of like I said, that none of this starts on October 7th. Since 2007 or 2008 or whenever the blockade started, Gazans have been living in a box. You know,
right. I mean, that was until Hamas started firing rockets.
Right. And, you know, it's kind of like you can justify it and say, oh, well, it's because of this, it's because of that. And it's collective punishment. You know, there are countries throughout the world that live next to enemy states, next to militant governments, you know, that are in a state of war, and they don't completely trap the entire civilian population in what people have called an open air prison or a concentration camp, you know, whatever you want to call it. And obviously part of that is the logistical differences of Gaza is small enough to do that.
Right. I mean, and the Israeli side is, we just did it for our security.
Right. But I would call it collective punishment. You know, you can it's not making us safer. Like all that happens is we have these buildups every single few years. You know, before this, it was 2021. Before 2021, it was 2019. Before 2019, it was 2018. Before 2018, it was 2014.
Right. And okay, so would you say that the actions of the IDF in Gaza so not only is it collective punishment, more extremist views are that it's genocidal. Would you go that far?
I would say that I was talking to friends about this last night, and like my emotions are really just like running about all of it. And something I kind of said was like, I don't care anymore about net population gain. If you killed 9,000 civilians, that's genocide. And that's kind of something that I'm trying to hold in my heart in terms of just like, I think that anger is important for me to hold on to in terms of fighting injustice. There are for sure different legal definitions of genocide that my understanding is would absolutely be applicable to Gaza. And I also know that it doesn't meet the colloquial definition of genocide that most people have in their head. So I kind of try and like not try and use that word because I think it devolves into like a conversation that I'm not interested in having.
So to take this a step further, would you say that the terrorists that are, by my definition, the terrorists who attacked Israel on 10/7 were genocidal in that they didn't care who they killed. They just wanted as many Israelis and as many Jews as possible to be tortured and go through as much pain and suffering as possible? Would you label them as genocidal?
I think that is, you know, a pretty understandable, appropriate reading of things.
Wow, cool. All right. When it comes to Israel giving warning to the Palestinians who live in Gaza City to move southward, why don't you think that's adequate courtesy and really notice? They're giving up the element of surprise there.
It's a sham. They have nowhere to go. You know, like, and they said go south, and now they're bombing the south now. And even in a vacuum, you know, there's just no precedent that that's like a valid courtesy that, oh, we warned you, so now it's fine to completely shell this, you know.
So, all right. So what is Israel to do when they have the network, the terror tunnels under civilian populations, under what would have been safe areas under military law? What is the just solution? Because I mean, absent of whatever the IDF is currently doing, I don't have a good answer.
Me neither. All I know is, you know, that this is definitely not it. I think there are forms of security and self-defense that, you know, do not rely on killing thousands and thousands of civilians. When last I checked, you know, kind of the number I saw of the amount of actual Hamas militants that have been killed, and like, I don't know if the numbers changed. I don't know if the first number I saw was accurate. I don't know if the numbers changed since then. But it was something in the hundreds. And as of now, the amount of civilians that have been killed is 9,000. And unfortunately, it is going to get higher. That's 100 to 1. That's an atrocity.
Right. I mean, it's 100 to 1 from Hamas to Palestinian civilians. How many of those could have been aiding the terrorists? Nobody knows. How many of those were just didn't have anywhere to go and just were the result of fate? Also, I would say no one knows. But an issue I generally have is when people say the death tolls aren't equal on both sides. That's only because Israel has superb defense systems. Would you say that comparing Israeli and Palestinian casualties and deaths are unequal or don't serve to further an argument?
I think it's very important context in terms of understanding the power differences, and that it's very important to look at to just a further understanding of the reality. I would probably agree that it's not like moralistically important, because like you said, it does come down to the difference in defense systems and other factors. And to me, that kind of, I don't see that as a detracting argument so much as any, materialistic observation of the reality is going to be important to finding a just solution. And kind of, we need to understand it highlights, like, that discrepancy more than anything highlights how thoroughly Palestinians are completely disenfranchised and abandoned, stateless, and helpless.
So let me we'll wrap this one up, and then I want to start off closing. Israel is in Gaza. They're projecting that it's going to take around a year to clear it out of all terror cells. And then what? Let's say there's another Palestinian election, just like in 2006. The Carter Center monitored it. Alan Dershowitz vouched for its independence and validity. Who should be able to run? Do you want to? Are you an advocate of bringing Fatah back in, the Palestinian Authority, for both the West Bank autonomy, or Area A, B, whatever you want to call it, and then Gaza as well? Is Fatah already a goner because Abbas is in his 18th year or 4-year term or something like that? What do you think happens after the Hamas dismantling?
I mean, my primary concern of after the Hamas, this like theoretical Hamas dismantling, that I'm very skeptical will happen, but whatever, that's like a whole other conversation. My primary concern is I would leave a power vacuum, and all that would happen was that an equally or more extreme militant group would take over. I would say that, I can't even imagine. I think it would have to be like a completely new body coming from the ground up. Like, Fatah doesn't enjoy any legitimacy in Palestinian society and international society. Like you said, Abbas is in his 18th year of term, whatever, and he's also 1,000 years old. And I do kind of want to say, touching upon this idea that they vote. I think you didn't mention this, so like, forgive me if you feel I'm putting words in your mouth. Kind of almost touched on it, like this kind of talking point that, Palestinians elected Hamas, they have whatever's coming to them. Besides getting into the fact that most of Gaza did not vote ever, they were too young to have ever voted in their lifetimes.
Well, that's currently. I mean, as a result of just the way the world works. I mean, children are responsible for their parents' actions.
Kind of like, first and foremost, the Palestinian, like, Hamas was elected, and any critiques of that are completely valid, and that just doesn't justify the blockade or any of the atrocities we've seen. And that's never a standard we would apply to any other, to any Western government. Certainly, nobody is going to say, Israelis voted for, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is like an out and out Kahanist with, a criminal record, connections to the Koch movement, and to a disciple of Baruch Goldstein, who is a mass murderer.
And convicted of inciting racism, and
yeah,
I'm no fan of Ben Gvir. You don't have to worry about
that. I'm sure. Don't worry. And nobody would say that. Oh, Israelis put Itamar Ben Gvir in power. We have they did it. They have what's coming to them. We can put them in a box.
I mean, that's not the same. It's not equivalent. I mean, one faction was firing rockets into Israel, and then Israel just says, "All right, fine. We're making a border fence on our own after we gave you the land."
Right, but it's not a border fence; it's a blockade.
Well, it's a blockade on 3/4 of it. I mean, just and they would say for security reasons. I'm sure they let more humanitarian aid in than Egypt, I believe.
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers. It's entirely possible, but it's still a blockade. It's there is degrees of aid going in and out and people coming in and out. Obviously, that's been completely shrunk and tightened since October 7th. But
right,
yeah.
Okay. All right. So in closing now, we are products of basically a similar upbringing all the way through college. What do you have to say to the yeshiva student going through the process now? I mean, in my community, listen, I'm a staunch Zionist. I think that the institution of the state should exist. I think that the Jewish people have historic, legal, cultural right to the land they now have in Israel. I think that the Palestinians are entitled to a state of their own. I don't think it's possible for Jewish autonomy to live on in a one-state solution. And I'm already considered a very left-winger in my community views. I'm against settlement expansion, like I said earlier. No, I don't think everything Israel does is right, nor do I think everything the Palestinians do is right. So my whole show is based on the premise, you never know enough, keep learning, and always question. Take in as many perspectives as you can. The answer in truth is somewhere in the middle. Keeping all that in mind, what do you want to tell the yeshiva student going through the insular upbringing we were both subject to?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail on the head in terms of keep questioning. I would kind of say, I think I would say two things in this. I very rarely, or pretty much never, tell people what to think. I share my views, but everyone's going to come to their own conclusions. I would say two things. I would say that, first of all, everything has to come back to human rights. That has to be the building point of anything, is the dignity and rights of all human beings. And I would say more in line with what you said, keep questioning, read things, look outside the box, and more to the point, it is going to be uncomfortable. You are going to read things that go completely against, if you grew up like we did, everything you've been taught since day one. And that is a gross feeling in so many ways. But you need to grapple with that discomfort. Sometimes it's going to be thinking about why that makes you uncomfortable and unpacking things that way, and just keep questioning, look outside the box, and embrace that discomfort.
All right. And for the people who would say, oh my God, but then I won't be accepted into the community. They'll shun me. My name will be diminished. My reputation will be gone. I won't get married. You would say what?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I have pretty thoroughly been shunned from a lot of spaces and communities. And it's because I stand up for what I believe in, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And through that, unofficial, shunned, and that I can still go to the 5 towns if I want. I'm not going to be stoned on site. I would say that through losing one community, I've gained another one. I am in an amazing community of on the ground left-wing activists, international Jews, Israeli Jews, Palestinians, And I wouldn't have it any other way.
Gotcha. All right, man. Sam, thank you so much for your time. I mean,
Yeah,
I had so many issues I could have picked with you. I don't agree on a lot, but I mean, I'm happy we had a civil discussion.
Yeah, me too. It was good for me because despite how I spend my free time, I'm like very anti-confrontation. So it's like really hard for me to, just like when I'm like arguing with family, like so much of the time I just like shut down. I'm just like, I don't want to have this conversation.
Right.
Like,
Right.
So this really made me like push through that discomfort. So thank you.
Awesome. All right, man. Thank you so much.
All right. You too. Have a good weekend.